Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for a few more people to join, and we'll get started on this. So thank you for your patience. Okay, so seeing that it's about 5:35 right now, I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you for attending. My name is Noah Burke. I'm from Wilson and Company, and we're a consultant working with the New Mexico Department of Transportation on this exciting project. The presentation today will be for the New Mexico Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, and this is our first public engagement meeting for District 1. There's just want to go over some technology type of things here. We will be accepting questions and answers, and you can do that by selecting at the bottom of your screen Q&A, and you can ask a question through that, and we will verbally answer those questions at the end of the presentation. And then any questions that we can't answer, we will make sure that we post it on the website, and we'll provide the website information for this project at the end of the presentation. We also are able to translate this into Spanish. As you'll see through the presentation, everything is translated into Spanish, and upon request, you can click on the bottom for an interpreter from English to Spanish who will be able to assist you. And with that, I'd like to hand this off to my colleague, Damon.
Thanks so much, Noah, and welcome everybody. My name is Damon Fordham. I'm with High Street Consulting, and we're the consultant team that's supporting the New Mexico DOT to develop this plan and support the public involvement efforts. This is the first of 6 public meetings to inform the development of New Mexico DOT's NEVI plan. Each meeting will cover similar content, but we'll focus each meeting broadly on one of each of the 6 districts in the state. So we go to the next slide. We can see the agenda for this evening. We're going to have some introductions from our New Mexico DOT colleagues, and then we'll talk a little bit about the planning context in the state for electric vehicles. Then we'll move on to the actual NEVI program itself, the National EV Infrastructure Program, and some of the requirements of the program. And then we'll look at some maps of where there's existing electric vehicle chargers in the state and where there's some opportunities to build out the network. And then we'll get some of your input from some poll questions. At the end, we'll talk about next steps and ways for everyone to stay in touch with the effort. So we're planning to be together today for up to 90 minutes, maybe less, depending on the extent of the questions. And we're very glad that everyone was able to join us. We've got about 30 or 35 folks here this evening with us, and we're happy you're here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Jerry Valdez with the New Mexico DOT to introduce himself and his team that's working on this effort.
Thank you, Damon. My name is Jerry Valdez. I work out of the Office of the Secretary as an Executive Director for the Department of Transportation. First, let me say thank you. This is time away from your family and friends, and so we want to make sure that we respect your time and give you as much information as necessary to get you understanding this NEVI program and what you can expect moving forward as it relates to electrifying our corridors here in New Mexico. Joining me today on this discussion are our projects director, Mr. Paul Montoya, as well as Mr. Leonard Manzanares, who is our EV project manager on this NEVI program. Also joining us is partners from across state agencies, including Energy and Minerals, Environment, and PRC. And so we believe we have a very well-rounded panel to allow us to give you information that will help you understand what our plan is, what we intend to do, and how we can serve you, our constituents. And so, Damon, thank you, and I appreciate everybody for taking time today to learn a little bit more about what we plan on doing and listening to you, the constituents, and how we can serve you best. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. My name is Paul Montoya. I am Program Director for the New Mexico Department of Transportation, and I also work out of the Office of the Secretary. My goal here, or my task, is to basically work on implementing the NEVI plan, making sure that our NEVI infrastructure plan is developed by the deadline, that it is submitted to the federal government on time so that we can receive the federal funding to start moving forward with the implementation of the NEVI plan. Working with me will be Mr. Leonard Manzanares. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Manzanares so he can introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Leonard Manzanares as well. I do work out of the Secretary's office under the leadership of Mr. Jerry Valdez and Paul Montoya. I will be the project manager out in the field, making sure that everything is ran accordingly and up to standards, up to NEVI standards, and of course, up to NMDOT standards. I'm excited about the project, and I'm really looking forward to rolling out this wonderful new implementation for the public of New Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Let's move on to the next slide there. Thanks, Noah. So this is the slide that's going to come up again at the end, but I wanted to put it up at the beginning just in case anyone has to drop off, because it has some important information on it. First of all, we'd love everyone to take our survey. So we have a survey as a separate information gathering effort to these meetings. And the QR code there on the screen, if folks hold their cell phone cameras up to that QR code on the screen, they'll be able to capture the URL, and you can do the survey right now while you're listening along, or save it for later on. I think we can also put the web link for that survey in the chat box, so we'll try and do that as well, so folks have the link. Secondly, if you have any questions or ideas after the meeting, they can be sent to the email address there on the screen, nmdot.neviplan@state.nm.us, and that email address is getting monitored for any ideas or questions or inquiries from folks out in the general public and from stakeholders. Thirdly, we have a project website that just went live. So you can go check that website out with some initial information. And as the project moves forward, we'll be posting updates and refinements to the information that's up there as we gather information and start to pull the plan together. Lastly, if anyone would like to provide their email address to the team so that you can receive future notifications, if you use the chat function and send a note with your email address to hosts and panelists, we'll be able to capture those and add you to our database to get any future notifications. So with that, we can move to the next slide, which is just an initial poll. We're going to have a few polls during the meeting here to gather some information. This one's a pretty easy one. This is just to gather information about zip code. So if people could just type in your 5-digit zip code into the poll, and once we've gathered a decent number of those, we'll close those out and we'll have captured that information. All right, I see some email addresses coming in, so that's great. We'll keep track of all of those, add those to our lists. All right, we can probably go ahead and close that poll now. All right. Have we closed that poll, Noah?
Yes, we have.
All right, great. So thanks for answering that. That'll be helpful information on our, just to see where we've got representation across the state once we get through all 6 of the public meetings. All right, so we can move on to the next slide. And then probably just the next one again. We're just going to talk a little bit about the context for planning for electric vehicles in New Mexico. So first of all, just a kind of a brief overview of what we're talking about here. We're talking about electric vehicles with a battery electric energy to power the motor. So all the energy for the vehicle is coming from the battery, and there is no use of gasoline or diesel, traditional internal combustion engine fuels. EVs use batteries which are charged by plugging the vehicle into a power source, a charger, and those chargers have 1 or more ports. So many folks with electric vehicles will charge at home, overnight perhaps, or maybe at their workplace. But for longer trips between cities, for longer distances, or between, for interstate travel, you need to have access to charging locations that are publicly accessible along your route. And that's what we're talking about today with this plan, is where to locate publicly accessible EV charging stations across New Mexico. Next slide. So nationally, there's a lot going on around electric vehicles and around how we respond to climate change. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that passed, it's also called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That's the federal infrastructure law, is part of what brings us here today. And we'll touch on that program and specifically the funding that was introduced for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program in a little bit. But first, in terms of what's happening in New Mexico, in 2019, the governor signed an executive order that committed the state to the Paris agreements and established a climate action priority. That executive order set a goal to reduce greenhouse gases by 45% by 2030, and subsequent work identified transportation electrification as a key strategy. Also in 2019, the state passed the Energy Transition Act, and that required investor-owned utilities to produce 100% carbon-free electricity in 2045. And the state also began to distribute funds from the Volkswagen settlement. And that funding was intended to reduce transportation emissions across the state and help deploy EV infrastructure. In recent years, the Environment Department have been hard at work continuing to distribute those VW settlement funds to qualified projects, and also leading a process for clean car rules, which were adopted earlier this month. So on the next slide, the clean car rule and the NEVI plan will help to reduce transportation emissions across the state. In New Mexico, transportation is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Nationally, it's the highest contributor, and about 97% of all transportation emissions are from the combustion of fossil fuels in internal combustion engines. So transportation electrification is a key strategy. The work that the New Mexico DOT is doing on this NEVI plan is joining with other efforts to address climate change. The DOT is actively working to build a climate change program. That's going to cover resiliency planning that will help make the infrastructure in the state more resilient to extreme weather and other hazards. Developing a carbon reduction strategy, implementing multimodal plans, including active transportation, and updating facilities with energy efficiency technologies and with solar. Other New Mexico DOT efforts will also be in the works soon, and there'll be other efforts for public involvement and stakeholder engagement, so keep your eyes peeled for those. So on this slide, we show where EVs are currently registered in the state. The bright green areas are zip codes that have at least 100 EVs registered as of today. So these are kind of the early adopters, and these are the areas we're likely to see EV adoption growing from in the future as more and more folks purchase and start to use electric vehicles in the state. Next slide here shows existing traffic volumes on the major roadways in the state. So this is average annual daily traffic, and you can see some of the busiest corridors are I-10 in the south from El Paso and Ciudad Juarez back and forth into Arizona, and then east-west across the middle of the state on I-40. In I-25 between Albuquerque and Santa Fe and up to Espanola and Los Alamos. And then also a little bit up in the northwest corner around Farmington and Bloomfield and Aztec. So that gives you a sense of sort of the existing context in the state and some of the background. And with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Carrie Giles, who's also on our consultant team. She's with ICF, and she's going to talk a little bit about the NEVI program and the requirements.
Thanks, Damon, and good evening, everyone. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So the NEVI Act, sorry, I know there's a lot of text on here, but with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, otherwise known as the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act of 2021, when it was passed last year, it appropriated billions of dollars of funding to numerous different programs. Part of that was $5 billion that were appropriated over 5 fiscal years, so beginning this year and going on for an additional 4 years. And this were appropriated to go for a formula program for electric vehicle funding. And this is what we're talking about here. It's the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, NEVI, Formula Grant Program is the official name of it. And it is going to bring in approximately $38 million to the state of New Mexico over the next 5 years for the program we're going to talk about. But this is just one of the many aspects, as Damon mentioned, for the infrastructure program that New Mexico is working on. So this is going to be charging for corridors, for the highways, essentially, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Additionally, and separately from this program, there's also bipartisan infrastructure law funding for competitive programs later on this year, rolling out in November. So this program is just going to be one aspect of a larger electric vehicle program, a larger electric vehicle effort that you'll be seeing statewide. What this program is, as I mentioned, focusing on the highways, and then the other programs, the competitive programs that will be coming later this year, those are available for community organizations, for MPOs. Those are putting in charging in public areas, putting in charging at schools. Separately, EPA just launched a new electric vehicle and clean alternative fuel school bus program called originally, the Clean School Bus Program. And that is bringing funding in to bring in, as I mentioned, those buses. So there's numerous programs available that you're able to get through via the website that New Mexico is hosting, and some of the links that will be here on this presentation online. But again, you can go through that website and find out more about the other fuels. But right now, tonight, we're focusing a little bit more on the NEVI program. So this program, as I mentioned, will distribute about $38 million to New Mexico for charging. And it's meant to be convenient, reliable, affordable, and equitable is the goal of the program. The goal of the program is to really create the interconnected networks nationwide that are able to move citizens, to move freight companies, to move fleets all over the country on an electric vehicle charging network. And then also within the state, we do know that we don't want anyone just to be able to travel. It's great, travel on the interstate with an electric vehicle, but then we do know there's the additional component of then once you get off the highway, where are you going with your electric vehicle and where can you charge? So that will be some of the recommendations here in the plan on how to address that with the additional funding that might be coming out or through other means, through Volkswagen funding, through everything else that's been happening. So this funding for the NEVI program, the initial funding is directed to be designated to designated U.S. Department of Transportation alternative fuel corridors and prioritizing specifically interstate highways. Those alternative fuel corridors have been nominated by the New Mexico DOT to the federal DOT, and those are the corridors that we'll be talking about here in just a moment. So if you go to the next slide. What we are doing is we are working on the plan then for how that funding will be distributed across those corridors. So just a bit of a timeline of what we're working on here is I think those who are in the know about the program or those who've seen the media know it's a very rapid program here to begin with. So the bipartisan infrastructure law was signed in November of last year. And then the guidance for the NEVI program specifically, the high level guidance, essentially the outline for the program was released in February. And we are currently expecting in late spring, sometime this month, the standards and requirements, which is a very detailed guidance. So what we're working on right now is trying to gather information on what the public needs, what those of you who are working to help implement this program, whether it be the utility, whether it be through community planning, whether it be because you drive an electric vehicle or you want to. We're trying right now to gather your information, as you see here for the summer, and then we'll take that information and apply it to the federal NEVI guidance and to the standards and requirements that are released to create this entire NEVI plan. The first year's plan is due August 1st, 2022. That is the initial plan for how New Mexico and every other state in the country will approach spending this funding over the next 5 years, as well as then continuing to maintain the funding, for beyond the stations for beyond 5 years. I note that this is the first draft, essentially, or the first round of this report. This NEVI plan can and will have to be updated annually. So this is the plan for now, but just keep in mind that this plan is a fluid plan and things can change, especially as the private industry works on stations within the state, and as other developments happen, whether it be political developments, whether it be different funding sources. There's a lot that can happen over the next 5 years, as I think we've seen from the last 5 years. So just know that this first year's plan or this first approach of the plan is due August 1st, which is rather quickly, 2.5 months away, but it will be updated continuously. So then the FHWA approval notification, whether the plan is approved or whether the plan needs more edits, will occur by the end of September. And essentially then they will release funding based off the guideline that we're still waiting on entirely from the standards and requirements. The funding for this program, that $38 million, some of that, of course, is spent on figuring out the master plan, but most of that funding is to provide 80% 80% federal funding for charging stations, which I will go into in a moment. And then 20% of that funding, that charging station cost and installation cost will be have to be covered by the company or the entity that is actually installing and running those stations. But so for this plan that's due August 1st, if you can go to the next slide, please. there are these components here, if you see listed down the left-hand side, or in Spanish on the right, and that these plan components, aka the chapters that will be in this plan that you will see, because these plans will all be publicly available. These are what we know from federal US DOT, from what's called the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. These are the guidelines that they have released. And if you look down the side, I think I've already seen some questions which are already kind of mentioned here a bit. Introduction, state agency coordination, how we're working with the other state agencies, how the funding, any New Mexico funding, whether it's Volkswagen or any other funding programs, how these all interact. Public engagement is obviously these meetings we're hosting here. This is the first of many public meetings over the next several weeks. And then between the website and the information requests that Damon has already mentioned, we're definitely trying to get more engagement and more feedback from what the public needs, especially about then these following chapters and areas. The vision and goals. What are the vision and goals of New Mexico? What is the overarching, aside from the federally mandated goals, what are the other overarching goals that New Mexico hopes to accomplish with this funding? Contracting, how will they work to actually deploy the funding? How will those charging entities or those companies that are hoping to install the stations, how will that happen? What mechanism? What are the requirements that will be included? Existing and future conditions analysis. Damon's actually going to present the beginning of that analysis here after I am done speaking to show exactly what charging stations are out there right now and what the other conditions are. The EV charging infrastructure deployment, again, very similar to the contracting. Then how exactly will this happen? What are the goals? What are the priorities of the state? And the implementation following right along, exactly how that's going to happen over kind of the 5-year plan. And again, that can be adjusted as the plan's updated annually and turned in again annually. Civil rights, equity, labor, and workforce, all very important components. Really trying to make sure that, and I'll go into these on the next slide as well, but really trying to make sure that this plan, this federal funding is actually put to use, is actually getting out there in the communities, is doing equitable distribution of stations, that really that everyone's able to access these, that trying to figure out what hurdles would prevent those from accessing these stations. These stations aren't meant just for the early adopters who've been able to afford electric vehicles the past several years. These stations are really meant to be for the entire community. So kind of looking at not just how do we get them into all the communities, but then in general, what are some of the other barriers, aside from cost, to deploying electric vehicles here. And then program evaluation, how will New Mexico review the program annually and then update the program, and then discretionary example or exceptions, if there's any exceptions to the federal rules and guidance that comes out, and cybersecurity to make sure these stations stay online. But if you can go to the next slide, I just want to dive a little bit deeper into a couple of the different components of this program. So for the NEVI infrastructure requirements, there are numerous requirements that the state has to evaluate. So to begin with, as I mentioned, these are along the alternative fuel corridors, which we will dive into a bit more in a little bit. But the charging stations have to be located every 50 miles. So really trying to get over that range anxiety, making sure if you get on the road from one, going south, north, east, etc., you don't just miss a station and then you're stranded. So they have to be along the interstate highway system, and then as well, then we'll show you some of the other roads they have to be along. And then they have to be within 1 travel mile. So as soon as you exit the highway, 1 mile from that point, not 1 mile from a very long exit ramp, but 1 mile actually from the interstate. We are also looking at just some other considerations. Obviously, there's components that you want to think about when doing siting requirements for charging stations. There's safety components. There's what's at, is there lighting? Is this a safe area to pull off if you're pulling off in the middle of the night? Is this an area where there's something else to be done? So there's other considerations that can go into the plan. These are just simply kind of some of the base considerations from the federal government. And then along those lines, there's charger requirements. Every location, not just, the preferred, but every single location that is funded by the NEVI requirements has to have 4 150 kilowatt DC fast chargers, or level 3, as some people like to refer to them, with combined charging system. This is a very specific type of charger ports. And they have to be capable then of simultaneously charging 4 EVs. So not only do they have to have the hardware to charge 4 EVs, but they actually have to have the electric capacity behind that to truly be able to charge. So there's some discussions that have to happen and will be ongoing discussions with the utilities. I see several of you here tonight on the call. And then as part of this, if you can tell, these are some very specific requirements. It's not your typical DC fast charging station, that might have one station, maybe 2 sometimes. Sometimes you see a bank, but very rarely do you see 4 stations currently together right now. So as a part of that, many stations that are existing in the existing infrastructure, as Damon will get into, don't actually count as an official site per the NEVI guidelines, because either they're not within the range of the highway system, or they do not have the required charging ports and capacity. So those sites are either going to have to be upgraded if they are within range, or essentially more sites will have to be added. So there's lots of considerations in this fun map game that we're doing right now, essentially to figure out what counts, what doesn't count, how do we fill in, how do we upgrade, etc. So if you can go then to the next slide. The other largely important component that I mentioned is the justice and equity considerations. The federal government has a Justice 40 initiative, which has been working to identify disadvantaged communities based on income and education level, as well as the following list of criteria. So it's not just a typical income, education level, race component for disadvantaged communities. There's additional items which aren't typically considered, especially traffic proximity. You might live in a nice area, or an area that wouldn't typically count, but you're right next to the highway. What can we do to clean up that highway traffic, even so that maybe if you can't afford an electric vehicle, you're at least benefiting from the cleaner highway traffic emissions. There's other climate change, energy burden, wastewater discharge, other components in here that aren't your typical components when you think of some of the just general justice and equity considerations. So we're looking at all of these different things to find out how we can truly help the communities that need the most help. Whether, as I mentioned, it's cleaning up the roads that they live nearby, or finding out ways to get them into electric vehicles as well, and access to charging. Obviously, we don't want these assets just to be on the highway and never to make it into the community. This, as I mentioned before, this program funds the highways, but we just know if we build it, we also then need to figure out separately for New Mexico a solution for getting into these communities that need it the most, if they're ever going to be able to make the change to an electric vehicle. So as you can see here, there's a ton of different considerations that we are looking at. So we will go ahead then and discuss those more in the plan, and would love your opinions on any of these when we're providing feedback here, especially if you have thoughts over any one component or another here. You can go ahead to the next slides. So what I was mentioning for the alternative fuel corridors is, as these are the ones that New Mexico has nominated to US DOT in the past, based off different things. So it's based off existing charging, it's based off planned charging. So these were the official interstate corridors. And here, as you can see, there's also some state and US corridors that were designated as EV ready or EV pending. And these are the ones that states have been directed to then make sure have infrastructure first, and to bring them up to those more stringent NEVI requirements. So if you see here, we've got the purple interstates, the pink state roads, and then the US highways. The interstates, the purple, are the ones that will be prioritized first, just based on the goal to get a national network with the national funding that's being used for this. So if you can go to the next slide, we'll zoom in then on District 1. And as you can see here, these are the goals, those that are in bold, starting with, of course, 25 and 10, or the interstate alt fuel corridors that we'll be working on first, or that the state will be working on, I should say, to make sure there's charging station. And then looking as well later on in the later years, the additional funding, the state and US highways that are being done. So these are just the ones that were considered official alt fuel corridors. There's other highways and roads, of course, on here, but these are the ones that have been designated per the DOT alt fuel corridor designation process. And that these will be the ones that will be focused on for this specific NEVI funding. Again, as I mentioned, lots of other state federal funding coming out. So please keep your eye on the New Mexico NEVI website, as well as some of the other resources that they will be posting there, because there will be more and additional funding for the other roadways and the communities later this year coming out from the feds. So I do just want to stop and ask a question here. I saw several entities listed there and our attendees, but which of the following applies to you? We're just trying to find out exactly who on the call today owns an electric vehicle, wants to own an electric vehicle, or is planning to purchase one, or doesn't have any plans. Again, we're working to make this an equitable program statewide. So we're not trying to cluster any specific charging in an area that already has, for example, electric vehicles. This charging station needs to go statewide. I'll just give Noah, are we getting the responses in?
Yes, we've got 23 so far out of 32.
Excellent. We just want to go ahead then and show the responses for what we have now.
Okay.
That's an interesting, fairly even mix. So essentially, between the group, we have about 60% who want to own an electric vehicle or are intending to one day, and then others who are not planning to. So this plan, again, is meant to be for everyone, not just for the early adopters, not for the late adopters, but to make it so that in the future, if you ever change your mind and find an electric vehicle you like, you're not stymied by any lack of available charging stations. So hopefully in the future, it'll help out those that even answered that they're not interested at the moment. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Damon to describe some of that existing infrastructure that we have out there.
Great, thanks so much, Carrie. And just a couple of reminders, we have the Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen, so the bottom to the left a little bit. If you have any questions, you can type them into that Q&A and we'll be going through those after the presentations and trying to answer those as best we can. There's also some answers coming in directly back through the Q&A function as well. If you want to post anything for everyone to see, all the participants, you can put it in the chat box and type it to everyone. I see a few comments coming in there as well on the chat box. So if we go to the next slide, we wanted to sort of show the kind of the current state of affairs in the state here. So this map shows all of the publicly accessible EV chargers that are in existence, on the ground working in the state today. There are 178 of them distributed around, as you see on the map there. And this includes all the publicly accessible chargers. So they could be level 1, level 2, DC fast chargers. They may be Tesla chargers with a certain type of connector. And they may or may not be located along a state highway or an interstate. If you go to the next one, you can see that just a little closer up here in District 1. So those, again, are publicly accessible EV chargers. The next slide shows the NEVI compliant existing chargers. So these are the ones that, based on our sort of initial assessment, meet the NEVI requirements. That is, they have their DC fast chargers. They have a CCS connector. That's the type of plug that plugs into the vehicle is a certain type, and they are CCS. They have 4 ports, so that means 4 vehicles can charge at once. They're within 1 mile, 1 travel mile of the interstate, and they are publicly available for 24 hours a day. And in the next slide is District 1, and you can see there's just two publicly accessible chargers currently in existence, one near Lordsburg at a Chevron, and then in Deming at the Walmart there as well. And I think someone may have already pointed that out in the Q&A. So this is essentially the same kind of map with those NEVI compliant existing charges, but we've just highlighted in bright green kind of what that means in terms of what parts of the corridors are covered. So again, the interstates here are in purple, and those bright green segments of the interstate are 25 miles in either direction from those NEVI compliant charges. The pink lines are the state highway designated as an alt-fuel corridor, and the sort of orangey color ones are US highways designated as alt-fuel corridors. So you can see with this initial priority on the interstate highway corridors for the NEVI funding, you can kind of see those gaps there that we need to look at to fill in with additional publicly accessible charges that meet those NEVI requirements. On the next slide is the same information for District 1. So you can see just the distance there between the two stations on I-10 at Lordsburg and Deming is just not quite enough. We've got a little bit of a gap there in between that needs to get filled in. All right, so with that, we'll move to a couple of additional poll questions, and then we'll start to try and answer some of the Q&A. So this question is about kind of where you think charging stations should be located, what types of areas. So if we bring up the poll, people can start to answer. If you can select up to 3, that would be appreciated. Up to 3 considerations of the types of areas where you think EV charging stations should be located. We'll give folks a minute to do that. You may have to scroll down to get to the bottom of the list of options there. While folks are doing that, I'm just trying to scan the chat box here, and we got some great dialogue going backwards and forwards. There's some folks with EV owners that are addressing some areas where they have trouble charging when they're out and about. So that's all good information that we'll capture and make sure we include in the plan. All right, how are we looking on this poll? It looks like we've got pretty good participation. Answers still coming in. I'll give Noah another second. All right, I think we're about there. So let's see, we've got most people saying that they should be located where there's gaps in the existing network. We've got a lot of votes for along highways with the highest traffic volumes, along interstates, and in rural areas as well. Not too many votes for cities and urban areas. I imagine that's because folks feel like there's either publicly accessible charging generally available, or folks can charge at home or at their workplace maybe. Some votes for tourism destinations, and then not too many votes for other or disadvantaged communities. So that's great information. Let's go to the next poll. Next slide and next poll. All right, so as that next poll comes up for folks, this question's about the amenities that you think are important for publicly accessible EV charging stations. So we're asking folks to select up to 5 of these from these lists of amenities that you think are most important, ranging from various things that folks might want to see at a publicly available charging station. And if for anyone's voting on other on the last poll or on this poll, feel free to drop a note in the chat and let us know what the other might be. All right, so I think we're still getting some votes coming in. All right, so looks like we've got a lot of votes coming in for bathrooms, for 24-hour access, and for safety and security. Those are like the top ones, as well as lighting. So lighting, restrooms, 24-hour access, and safety and security. Kind of a second tier here is shade, shelter, and food and beverage. And then less interest in having a customer service person on site and having retail or shopping. So that's interesting. So not too much interest in shopping, but definitely restrooms, food and beverage, 24 hours access, lighting, and safety. Great. Okay, final poll on the next slide is kind of an open field. So people have already been putting some of this information in the chat box. That's great, about just sort of specific areas where they feel charging is needed. So just type in the open field here, kind of just general areas. So it could be a city, it could be near a city, it could be a corridor between two cities, a county, a pueblo, a university area, a tourist destination, kind of wherever you think that may be helpful to have charging, and we'll pull those responses together, and that'll help inform the plan.
And yes, for those in the chat, for the NEVI stations, they are all DC fast charging.
All right, probably about it having good responses there, Noah. So we won't see the feedback on this because it's an open poll, but we will compile all those and add those to the mix for the plan development. So so let's go to the next slide. We'll sort of wrap up the presentation section here a little bit. So what's next? This is the first of 6 public meetings. We're also doing listening sessions with key stakeholders in the private sector and nonprofits and advocacy groups and interested parties. So that's all happening right now. It's helping to inform the development of the plan. And the goal is we submit a compliant plan, we get it approved, and then the state, the feds will sign off on the plan, and the state will start to receive the funding in each year over the next 5 years. We're thinking that the goal, what we're hearing, is the funding will start to flow out. The goal is at the end of this calendar year, and then of course there'll be time that's needed for contracting and procurement, and then design and construction before stations are actually put in the ground. One thing I want to stress, again, we've said a few times today, but the plan is intended to directly respond to the very specific requirements of the NEVI program that we've talked about. But what we're gathering here in the public input and the sort of broader considerations in the plan that we're putting together will help inform a broader array of publicly accessible EV charging infrastructure across the state. So whereas in this first round of priority, we may not be able to get to some of the more rural areas that are off in the states. Those areas will certainly be considered for future rounds with discretionary grant programs, other funding sources, because there's a real need and an interest to make sure that there's equitable access across the state for all areas, not just those that are on the interstate. But that said, you know, the federal requirements in these early rounds is for a national network with that focus on the interstates. So those are the next steps. Let's turn to the Q&A, and this is the first one of these we've done. So forgive us as we're tag teaming here between the consultant team and the DOT folks on the line. But we've got a number of questions that have come in the chat box. So I'm going to try to kind of moderate those a little bit, and Carrie and I can help answer, and certainly invite Jerry and Paul and Leonard to help answer as well. If you have any questions, again, go down to the bottom of the screen, click on that Q&A tab, and we'll start to work through them. As we're working through that, Noah, why don't we go to the last slide just to bring that up again, so folks can see that QR code for the survey and start to write down some of those web addresses and emails if they want to do that when while we're answering the questions. So let's see. I'm going to go through some of the questions that have already been answered. So one question was about rollout for level 3 stations. That's another way of saying DC fast charging stations across the state this year. And what's planned for the southern area of the state in particular. And so Mr. Valdez has said that the DOT is identifying gaps in areas that's not covered under the NEVI program in the southeast, as well as other areas, northwest, northeast, and may utilize other funding made available by Volkswagen, ARPA, Capital Outlay, and then as these federal grant programs start to roll out, we'll also be applying for those grant opportunities. Let's see, there's a question about sort of rollout of equity and geographical distribution, and the fact that there's existing stations around Albuquerque and Santa Fe, but maybe not in other areas, and how is the DOT going to help other communities. We've talked about that a little bit. You know, again, the priorities on the interstate highway system every 50 miles for this first round of NEVI funding and the first years of the NEVI funding rollout. And then as that network starts to get built out, then the state will be looking to make sure other areas are kind of filled in with different types of charging that may be needed, and leveraging other funding programs as well. Let's see, a question about the Randolph-Shepard Act and giving priority to blind entrepreneurs. And response there was that you know, any provisions that are required will be followed. So whether it's a you know, state statute, federal requirements, use of transportation funds, obviously the requirements in the NEVI program itself, all those will be followed in the rollout of this program. Let's see. Question about the 2 DC fast charging stations on I-10 between Deming and Lordstown, and none on I-25, and what's the time frame to institute the rollout of those charges on I-25? So answer there was that we plan on prioritizing gaps that exist today, and then those areas will be prioritized and built out with a target of the infrastructure every 50 miles along the interstate. And Jerry, feel free to chime in on any of these if you want to as well.
Thank you, Damon.
All right, let's see. Outside of the interstate highway system, any plans for state highways? And only looking at the interstate will only target a small portion of the state geographically. Yeah, definitely agree with that. Obviously, you know, the end goal is a much broader rollout across the state, looking at state highways and US highways beyond the interstate highway system, and also communities around the state that may need charging as well. But the initial focus here on the first few years is the interstate program, is the interstate highway system, and building out that national network. The discretionary grant programs that are coming, that we're expecting from the feds, it's another $2.5 billion nationally. That's a competitive grants that we'll have to apply for. So one reason to make a really good plan here, this first round, is to help position the state in a good place for some of those future discretionary grants. And those can be used in much more, we're anticipating they'll be able to be used in a much more flexible way without the sort of quite tight restrictions and requirements for this formula funding program that we're looking at now. And then let's see, any plans to coordinate with local governments that could benefit EV growth for residents and governments who might not have the funds to invest in EV fleets? And again, the answer there is really looking forward at those future discretionary grant programs that we're anticipating coming later in 2022 that will be more targeted to community needs. Let's see, a few other ones here, and I might tag Jerry or Carrie to answer some of these so I don't get too hoarse. Jerry, will these charging stations be maintained by the DOT or will they be managed by a company?
Thank you, Damon, and that's a great question. One of the things that we are planning on doing is partnering with private industry to provide not only data collection requirements, but also operation and maintenance. So our performance agreements will include components when they get installed with the vendors to provide that operation and maintenance moving forward. And so DOT will not be supporting and operating them, but they will require analytics to be collected, data to be shared with the state, as well as operation and maintenance of those EV charging stations across those corridors.
Great. Another one for you probably here, Jerry, is, oh, it just went away on me, but it was, well, I'll move to the next, one. Are rest areas, rest stops being considered for charging stations?
You know, that's a great question. And when you think about the interstate system and you think about rest areas, it seems to make a lot of sense to utilize rest areas for the purpose of EV charging stations. However, there are provisions within the federal guidelines that prohibit the commercialization of these rest areas. And so we're working through our federal partners to work through the restrictions that currently exist in putting these EV charging stations at rest areas. And so as it stands today, we are currently not able to commercialize rest areas for the sale of electricity for the purpose of EV charging. But we are working with our delegation and our federal partners to see if that can be opened up moving forward.
Great, very nice. Okay, what is the status of the Volkswagen mitigation funding, the settlement funding that the state received, and are all of those funded stations online?
And so to answer that question, Damon, we have worked with our sister agency, the Environment Department, to distribute those fundings through a process that they established. Currently, I don't believe that all of the funding has been utilized for the expansion of the EV infrastructure. But one of the things that we are taking advantage of during this NEVI program is that we're identifying Volkswagen settlement funds that exist. And because of the cost share that exists with NEVI, that allows us to use any type of state or private partnerships, we want to target those Volkswagen settlement funds to maximize the footprint of this NEVI program. And so we are looking at any existing Volkswagen settlement fund that have not been utilized and making sure that if there is an opportunity to partner with those that have received that type of funding through the Volkswagen Settlement Fund, that we piggyback off of the federal funding and the Volkswagen Settlement Funds to stretch every dollar to make sure that this infrastructure is built out. DOT does not oversee the Volkswagen Settlement Fund, but we do work with our sister agency in making sure that those funds will be used if is feasible with the NEVI funding as well.
Great, thanks. Let's see, I'll take a couple now here that I can answer. So what about reliability requirements for the charging stations? We would hate to need to use one and not be functional. And also, how about dependency on the power grid? So that's a great question. Certainly, as we've talked to the EV charging installers and operators, we've talked a lot about reliability. There are requirements in the federal guidelines for 97% uptime. Obviously, that's higher than some folks have experienced who have been out there and had to use a public charger and it hasn't been working, or there's been a software glitch. So definitely reliability and uptime is a key consideration and will be built into any kind of procurement with the private sector partner. And then certainly the power grid is key. These are very, very high power installations that need three-phase reliable grid power. So as we're doing more of our analysis work and we're looking at various locations, some have three-phase power and are relatively, the connections are relatively straightforward. Others are much more challenging and going to have to require some innovative solutions. Along those lines, there was a question about plans to use renewable energy for the charging stations, and that's also something we've been talking to the EV installer companies about, whether there can be solar installations or battery storage at these locations. And some of those innovative solutions might be needed in some rural areas. Yeah, go ahead, Jerry.
Thank you. And if I can take an opportunity to ask Ms. Mary Jane Parks to join the conversation, I want to make sure that everyone on the call understands that this is a multi-agency initiative, and we work very closely with our sister agencies along state agency lines. And so, Mary Jane, if you can introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you've been working on in regards to the energy grid and what you envision the state doing moving forward.
Okay, hi, thank you, Jerry. My name's Mary Jane Parks, and I'm a U.S. Department of Energy solar innovator, helping the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission with grid modernization and specifically transportation electrification initiatives. So we're looking at the 3 IOUs and the cooperatives, their plans for transportation electrification, how they're going to charge within their service territories, the electric vehicle, either incentivize with time of use rates at people's homes or help work with New Mexico DOT and other state agencies to charge, have fast chargers in their service territories. So it's a great question about how can we utilize more renewable energy at these facilities. And well, a lot of the utility planning and they have to meet their own goals for achieving renewable energy, their portfolio. And so the best way is to encourage our utilities and cooperatives to have more renewable energy within their supply portfolio. And then it will cover more and more of our transportation needs. So it's a very high level answer. But it's great thinking on your part, and so I encourage you to keep asking those questions, because we can put solar and wind at isolated charging facilities, but unless there's battery, they wouldn't be able to provide that at night, and probably not quickly either. So it's a little complicated, but we can supplement that charging with renewables that are already in the whole portfolio that energy utility and cooperative is supplying. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mary Jane.
Great. Okay, let's go through a few more questions here that are still open. Let's see, there was a question about whether or not any local mayors have any involvement in the program or other government agencies, or if it's strictly a New Mexico DOT project. I think Jerry kind of answered that, but I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to mention there, Jerry, about sort of interagency coordination.
Yeah, thank you, Damon. And one of the things we really want to focus on with our local communities is that we want them to understand that there are going to be additional funding sources available that they can apply for through the NOFO process. And the discretionary grant program, which are community funded grants provided by USDOT, will provide local mayors and local government entities associated with transportation to apply for these funds. And help to build out this rural infrastructure EV network. As well as we're looking at every 50 miles, we definitely want to take into consideration partnering with our public partners to where we can get into cooperative agreements that when we're targeting those 50-mile intervals along our interstate and alternative fuel corridors, that we can work with local government bodies to see if there's opportunities to partner, as well as once the once the corridors are certified by the US DOT and the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, we'll have a little bit more opportunities to use any funding available. This is a $38 million project, but if there's any additional funds that are available at the tail end of the project, we'll be able to use it in a much more discretionary way and partner with cities around the state and communities that may have been left out because of being off of the corridors. And in that way, we will definitely be able to fill the gap throughout the state with that funding through a discretionary grant process.
Thanks, Jerry. Let's see, another couple of shorter questions. So will locations be limited to state-owned land, or will privately owned property be considered? We've talked about that a little bit. Kind of the answer's both, really. Certainly the DOT is looking at any state-owned land where they could leverage that for the installation of charging infrastructure, but also they're very likely to be partnerships with private property owners as site hosts to install charging on their property as well. So that is all being worked out, and will be part of the sort of the planning and procurement moving forward. Is NEVI spending aimed at DC fast charge, or will level 2 be considered? Again, the NEVI formula program funding that we've been talking about, 38 million, with these sort of strict requirements, is limited to DC fast charging every 50 miles along alternative fuel corridors, with a priority on the interstate system, 1 mile or less from the interstate. Level 2 charges are likely to be considered for some of the future discretionary grant programs that might come out for community charging. Let's see, maybe one for our DOT colleagues here. Are there any plans for electrification of the New Mexico DOT fleet?
Yes, absolutely. And we also have our sister agency, Nidra Murphy, who works in conjunction with all state agencies and looks at our public fleets. So the short answer is yes, but I don't know if Nidra wants to share a little bit more information if she's available on the call or not. I thought I saw her earlier.
Jerry.
Hello,
Can you hear me?
Nidra. Yes,
Hi.
we can hear you loud and clear. And I want to highlight the relationship once again that we do have with our sister agencies. So Nidra, if you can talk a little bit about the state's plan that aligns with NMDOT's plan to electrify the fleet across state agencies moving forward.
Sure. So first, I guess I'd start with there are state and federal requirements for state fleets to have a certain percentage of electrification. In major cities, the federal government requires 75%, and our own New Mexico Alternative Fuel Vehicle Acquisition Act requires a mix of 75% can be either some type of alternative fuel, which majority of the time is probably going to be electrification or electric vehicles. So we are working, and I'm with the Energy and Minerals Natural Resources Department, the Alternative Fuel Program Manager. So sorry, I didn't introduce myself. And we are working closely with our General Services Department on procurement and trying to make sure that the state fleets have the vehicles available. Different departments and agencies have different needs. For example, in Energy and Minerals, we don't just do energy, but we also have the state forest lands. And state parks, their requirements for a vehicle are going to be different. They're going to need something that can go in those rural, mountainous areas at times, versus other state fleets that maybe only need to stay within, certain metropolitan areas, and will have those type of vehicle requirements, light duty requirements. So it's something that we're working on. It's something that we also have requirements to fulfill. And this is a really exciting time especially with the federal funding, I think there's going to be a lot more options available for us to meet those goals. So I hope that answers the question. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, Deidre.
All right, I feel like we should give Carrie a chance to answer a couple of things here. So let's try her. Are there vendors in New Mexico who will do the work for data collection or services, or will it be outsourced to out-of-state companies, potentially negatively impacting New Mexico residents, and maybe folks who are maybe lower income or employed maybe at a traditional gas station? I don't know, Carrie, you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the NEVI requirements in that regard, and Jerry can fill in as well.
No, yes, the goal of the federal DOT in creating the program, it is quite often lost as Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's meant to actually spur local jobs wherever the funding is spent. So there is a goal in there, and some of the RFI requirements that Jerry and his team at the DOT will be working on later on will actually be to find out what's available in the local community. I know there was another question that I believe Leonard answered in the chat as well about then working to maintain and trying to do the operations and all those contracts. The funding is not just to install, the funding is to install and keep the stations up for a period of time. So there will be local people that will be needed on the ground, local workers. So yes, we aren't just replacing, or we aren't just eliminating jobs with this funding. It will be to actually replace and help people switch into the career of being able to work on these kind of electric vehicle charging stations. And Jerry, I'm not sure if you had more.
No, I would just want to say I work for the state of New Mexico. I'm born and raised New Mexican, love our blue skies, and more than the blue skies, I love New Mexicans. And the intent of the IJA funding is to put people back to work. And my priority and my focus all along is to identify partnerships that we can engage with. And I'm not ashamed to say that I'm going to put New Mexico first before anything else. As a public servant for New Mexico, it's our jobs to help out our communities, our local communities, our rural communities, and help New Mexicans get back to work in jobs that are sustainable and that really build towards the future. And so that question is really near and dear to my heart. And we will absolutely make sure that we are looking at putting New Mexicans back to work and providing sustainable jobs that they can work into the future with this new technology and the emerging innovation that comes with electric vehicles, not only in infrastructure, but also the questions about maintaining vehicles and giving individuals an opportunity to understand the components of electric vehicles so that when we transition our fleets into alternative fuel vehicles like EVs, that we have people that can work on them, who we can hire not only in the urbanized areas, but when we're looking at DOT, we have patrols throughout our state, more than 90 patrols around the state that offer jobs and opportunities for the local rural communities. And that's something that I will absolutely, as an executive of the Office of the Secretary, ensure that we're making a priority as this program is moving forward. And I will not apologize for putting New Mexico first, even though it's a federal program.
Thanks,
And as
Jerry.
as Damon mentioned as well, the 97% uptime, that actually requires a lot of on-the-ground support to really make sure these stations are maintained, and that requires local labor to work on those. So it's absolutely going to be a cause. Working on stations, actually, if for those who've actually installed a station, you've got to trench, you've got to install signage, you've got to install lighting. There's more to installing an electric vehicle charging station than just plopping down a charging station in the middle of a parking lot. So lots of opportunity for local workers.
All right, we just have a few questions left here, and then I think we'll plan to try and close by the top of the hour here. This one is kind of a two-part question, so I thought maybe Carrie and then maybe Mary Jane could help answer it. In fact, Mary Jane might even be starting to type an answer. Will the anticipated increase in demand for electric power require a build out of the grid and perhaps potentially even result in a rate increase? So Carrie, I wondered maybe you could talk to the sort of like what happens to with any increase in power requirements for the grid, and then Mary Jane could maybe talk a little bit about the implications for rates.
Absolutely, and it looks like Mary Jane just actually answered the question a bit. But the catch is that for these DC fast charging stations, these will be utilized all hours of the day. You know, especially think of your morning, your evening commute for those driving, those doing road trips, those out running errands. For DC fast charging stations, especially along highways, there's not exact rhyme or reason right now for what the charging utilization data is. So whenever we see peak driving times on highways, that's when these stations will actually be also be at their peak load. And we do know sometimes that load can be at the same time as our peak load to begin with. So yes, there will be an anticipated increase, and that is something that why we are trying to work with the utilities and why we're trying to figure out this plan. And another reason why the plans are flexible over 5 years is to make sure that there is enough power to simultaneously power those 4 electric vehicles at one time. So yes, there is lots of planning here. And as Mary Jane noted, I know I will let her speak in a moment, there's other plans for other electric vehicle programs that are nighttime programs. So they will help hopefully balance out the load overall over the next 5 years, but I will let Mary Jane speak a bit more about that.
You're muted.
You're on mute, sorry.
Mary Jane, you're muted if you're able to unmute.
I'm so sorry.
No
I was
problem.
muted.
Okay.
I was brilliant though. You missed that. Okay, Carrie, good job on answering the question. It's a great question. I think the more right now in the short term, if we can use power at night, it's going to keep our costs down for the utility to run their power plants and build out their battery storage. So short term probably is manageable. In the long run, we don't know yet, but we have to create more power supplies for a much larger demand of electricity. And personally, I think that because solar and wind, the cost of these resources are coming down, already have been. They're much more competitive than typical fossil fuel power right now. So the more they keep coming down, the better it is for all of us as ratepayers, that we're not going to be spending a lot more of our income on energy. So it's a good question, something that society has to address in the long run. But I think with good planning, we can keep the costs low. Yes.
Thank you both. Okay, a couple other questions here. Let's see, if rest stops do get used in developed EV sites, again, that's right now, there is a prohibition against commercial activity in the rest stops, but that may or may not change in the future. But if rest stops do get used as EV sites, how would you separate semi-truck and heavy equipment traffic from the smaller electric vehicles? I mean, I think there, and no reason to think that those smaller passenger vehicles would be treated any differently as normal safety considerations for folks in passenger vehicles stopping at rest stops and trying to keep safety front and center in mind. But I don't know, Jerry, if you have any other thoughts there.
No, you nailed it when you said safety is on the forefront of everything we do. DOT prides itself in making sure that not only that our employees are safe, but the motoring public is safe. And so priority of safety is of huge concern. And so if that does happen, and of course, because of the motoring public sharing that space, we will do everything we can from a planning perspective to make sure that everyone who is within the confines of a rest area are safe, and that there are provisions that ensure that the individuals who are visiting our rest areas, if in fact going for charging, if it ever opens up, the planning would be heavy on safety and making sure that the plan includes making sure people are able to safely energize their vehicles with the charging stations, as well as the commercial vehicles who use those areas for rest and for other amenities as well. So safety, safety, safety.
And also, I'll just add too, while the NEVI program is focusing on light duty vehicles, on the passenger vehicles, and has been interesting within the larger Infrastructure Act, there are lots of provisions to try to future-proof and plan for heavy duty electrification, down towards the end of the program. There's also the consideration now of, if it was a rest stop, if someone's buying, one of the pickup trucks, the Ford, the Chevy, the Rivian, that are now electric, brand new off the line this past month, and they're towing a camper, are they going to be able to charge at your standard electric vehicle charging station if it's a front end parking spot? So there are larger considerations, particularly for rest stops, that will be, a factor in then if the rest stop ever does get opened up by the federal DOT for commercial activities, as they're calling this. Another reason why the plan will be updated every year and flexible in case that does open, and that is a possibility in the later years.
So a couple other questions related to kind of engagement and reaching certain types of stakeholders. The ones about telecommunications companies, ones about businesses within a mile of the highway. And the question about the businesses, will you wait for them to contact you, or will you be reaching out? I think, what we're trying to do as a team here is get the word out far and wide in a very short amount of time that we have to develop the plan. So anything, anyone on the line can do to help with that. If you're a stakeholder and you have, stakeholder lists, distribution lists, please do, send the survey out, send the contact mechanisms out for us to hear from folks. We're probably not going to be able to reach out to, every potentially viable business in various locations. But we're hoping to be able to get the word out that this is happening and hear back from folks like, any of the partners that Carrie and Jerry have mentioned, whether, public, private, nonprofit, to make sure we develop a plan that's going to, serve the needs of the state as best it can and be, viable and successful for really getting charging out there where it's needed. But I don't know if Jerry or Carrie want to answer any more on that one.
If I can just add that the private-public partnership is very unique with this program. And so we want to make sure that we're following all relative procurement rules that govern how we interact with our private partners. And so we have been speaking with our GSD director for procurement, making sure that we're working together, looking at best practices that have been established throughout the nation in regards to procuring these types of services through a private-public partnership. And really, we've already had industry reach out to us. And so until we actually embark on our procurement process, it's completely acceptable to hear the voice of communities. And we want to hear that voice to see what the interest is. And then once we go down the route of procurement, it'll be posted and it'll be advertised competitively. And we will make sure that all relative procurement rules are followed, ensuring that we're doing it equitably, transparent, and as well giving opportunity for everybody to participate in those targeted areas.
Great. All right, one last question here, and then we'll kind of close things out. So someone's done some math here. $38 million over 5 years. DC fast charging at maybe 20 sites. So is that 7.6 million a year and installation of 4 sites per year? The math is probably not. It's probably more complicated than that in practice. There's obviously delay time in terms of the procurement and working with the private sector. The private sector is telling us it can take maybe up to 12 months to work through all of the actual installation itself. Might only take a month to get something in the ground, but all of the permitting and design, partnerships, figuring out the site hosting can take longer. So I think all that is still a little bit in flux. There's also the opportunity to leverage other funds, and then just in terms of actually how the funding really flows, it's probably going to be a little bit less linear than the basic math would indicate. But I think the intent both of the federal government as well as folks at the DOT is to get everything moving as quickly as possible. There is definitely a desire to get charging stations in the ground as quickly as possible, again, particularly along those interstates, and really start to make progress quickly. So I guess stay tuned, and we'll see how quickly everything moves in terms of plan approvals and the funding that actually flows, and then how quickly the private sector partners can help to get the deployment rolled out. But there is certainly an urgency on all sides to really make this happen as quickly as possible. All right, I would just invite Jerry or any other folks, if there's anything else you wanted to mention before we close, and then I'll just go back to this last slide and wrap up.
I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. I think there was about 40 attendees. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with your Department of Transportation. I also want to mention that if there's anything that we didn't answer, or if you have questions, it was mentioned that our website is up. Please feel free to email us. We want to be as accessible as we can to every single one of our constituents throughout the state. This is your project. We just get the privilege to manage it on your behalf. And so please, if there are any pressing questions that you have that you need answers to, send them over our way. We have a team that is dedicated and committed to this project, and to make sure that we do the best we can and fulfill not only the intent of this law by putting New Mexicans back to work, by getting this infrastructure built out, but that we do it in a way that benefits the entire state. And so thank you for spending time with us, and thank you for your interest. And again, if you do have questions, please send them our way. We want to be accessible to you. We work on your behalf. So thank you.
Very good. We will close there. I couldn't have said it any better, Jerry. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone on the team for the meeting and for everyone who attended. Next meeting will be on Thursday evening for District 2, same time, if anyone wants to join, but the information will be largely similar. But again, it's the Q&A often. It's the really interesting part that helps us. So we're looking forward to future meetings. I just put in the chat box a link to the survey. Please do go complete the survey, send it to your friends, your family, your great aunts, anyone and everyone who might be interested in taking that and providing information. There's also the QR code here on the screen. You can just snap a photo of it. It'll take you to the link as well. We thank you all for your time and attention, and we're looking forward to working with everyone to roll out a great plan.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.